Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all very much for joining us today for our February installment of the iMapInvasives monthly webinar series, where today we will be talking about the intersection between iMapInvasives and iNaturalist, so how the two programs interact with each other and how we leverage data from one to the other. So my name is Douglas Knopf. I am the Invasive Species Project Specialist for the New York Natural Heritage Program. I'm also joined today by Mitch O'Neill, our invasive species biologist, who is sat next to me. We'll be talking through my microphone as we go through the presentation. A few housekeeping things before we get started. Today's webinar is going to be recorded. Everybody who registers will be receiving an email within the coming days after the webinar concludes with a link to the recording posted to our YouTube channel, as well as links to any resources that we talk about during the webinar or anything that would be useful to share. Everybody's microphone is muted and it is on moderated unmute mode, so we will have time at the end. If anybody wants to ask any questions verbally, we can unmute at that time. In the meantime, if anybody has any questions that come up during the webinar, feel free to throw them into the chat. We will have Mitch monitoring the chat box and he'll be able to answer questions throughout. And with that, we will go ahead and get started. So the agenda for today, go through a brief introduction, talk about the history and background of iNaturalist and iMapInvasives, go through a little bit of information about data sharing, the Vision API and machine learning technology, prioritizing or priority record scanning, looking through the databases for high priority species records, and how we can utilize iNaturalist data in our various analyses that we run. So a little bit of background. Although we are often referred to as the iMapInvasives team, the real organization that we work for is the New York Natural Heritage Program. And this is the organization that is tasked with being the data collectors and record keepers of all of New York State's rare, threatened, and endangered species and ecosystem information. And as one of the greatest threats to rare species is the spread and establishment of invasive species, New York State established the Invasive Species Database Program within the New York Natural Heritage Program. iMapInvasives is the database software and platform that we use to administer the Invasive Species Database. And this is software that is used by multiple states throughout the US, but it is our official platform for New York. So we administer the database through that. We collect our invasive species information from our various community scientists and professional partners throughout the state and host it in our public database. We also maintain a host of different data collection applications, such as our Watercraft Inspection Stewardship Program application, WISPA, and we use all of that incoming data to do various data analyses and different prioritization models to help make that information coming in more digestible and usable by our different partner agencies. So talking about iMapInvasives and iNaturalist, oftentimes people wonder if we are kind of in active competition with one another. And the overall answer is no. Although they have their own unique database and the way they do things is different than the way we do things, we understand that they are a great asset. They are very widely popular. Everybody knows iNaturalist. A lot of people use their different applications or have like the Seek app on their phone. So rather than try to be in competition with them and one-up them and try to be the better database, we put our effort towards collaboration with them and trying to get data from their platform onto our platform, have our user bases kind of cross over with each other, and understand that, we serve different roles in the environmental community, capitalizing on that. So contrary to the image on the screen there, we see iNaturalist as more of a collaborator than a competitor. And a brief overview of how each of these different programs came to be. A lot of people will often ask us if we are related in any way, mostly because we both have a lowercase I at the beginning of our name, which was just sort of the style at the time in 2005 when both of our programs were first conceived. But both of our programs, iNaturalist and iMapInvasives, both were conceived and grew independent of one another to serve different purposes. So iNaturalist was originally launched as a master's project, was its own individual corporation, had a variety of hosts and academic partners throughout the years, and is currently its own independent nonprofit organization. iMapInvasives, again, was conceived around the same time, but was initially created to serve that kind of professional capacity. We understood that there was a need for a invasive species centric database to record all of the invasive species work that was going on. And so we worked with the university, or Florida State University, to create this database program and made it the official platform for the New York Invasive Species Database program. And throughout the years, similar to iNaturalist, we have had several different hosts. We have worked with several academic organizations. And as of right now, we are currently in another one of those host transitions. People may have heard rumors that we have been moving from NatureServe to Cornell's Integrated Pest Management, and that is what is ongoing right now. So if anybody has heard of this host migration, rest assured that there will be little to no impact to the average iMapInvasives user. You probably won't really notice much of anything changing while this is going on in the background. And even though the host is changing, the people behind the New York iMapInvasives team will all be remaining exactly the same. New York Natural Heritage Program will still be administering the database program for New York. We will still all be here doing the same things that we have been doing, but the actual data hosting server side, that will be changing from NatureServe to Cornell. If anything major is changing, or if we need any active participation from iMapInvasives users, we will be in communication with our user base and letting you know what needs to be done. But in the meantime, nothing really is happening. And all that to say that iNaturalist and iMapInvasives have grown independent of one another and have unique goals. And to talk a little bit about those unique goals, I'm going to hand it over to Mitch.
Sure. Thanks, Doug. And yeah, just to reiterate what Doug was saying before, yeah, we're really excited to start working with Cornell IPM soon. And yeah, they'll be providing the software, like the interface that you see when you log into IMAP. And that's for like the network as a whole. That's not just New York. That's also the other anyone that uses IMAP in North America. And yeah, like Doug said, uh, Heritage Program will still be playing that same role as like the point of contact for IMAP users and, getting data into IMAP and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, we'll still work with all of you on all that. But we're excited for the, upcoming work with Cornell IPM. And yeah, so for the two platforms, just want to talk a little bit about how they're quite different, and I think a lot of that has to do with what the goals are, because the goals are quite different. So with iNaturalist, their main goal is to build this online social network of naturalists to share observations of the natural world, mostly, observations of individual species. And so they have that like social media component. They have crowd-based species verification, point only, presence only. They don't get into like more complex geography type stuff. And they've also, iNaturalist has stated in several blog posts and on their web pages that they really don't see themselves as a data repository. They kind of seem that way to a lot of us because they have so much data, so many people are collecting data in that platform. But their focus is really supporting the community of naturalists to learn about nature from each other, submit observations. Their focus is like collecting data in iNaturalist. They don't see themselves as a data repository. They don't accept bulk data sets from other inventory, from other, databases or literature, that kind of stuff. So they don't see themselves as a one-stop shop for distribution data. And so iMapInvasives, in contrast, rather than we're not focused on all species. We're specifically focused on invasive species, and while it's built so that anyone can use iMapInvasives, anyone can submit observations, the primary goal is for managers to leverage the data and tools. So that's a very specific and different use case than iNaturalist, and because of that, there are some differences. So instead of the crowd-based species verification, With IMAP, the admins for each state will give trusted experts permissions to confirm records within their state. We also, because of those management and wanting the database to be useful to managers, we also have to go beyond points. So we have lines and polygons, and we go beyond presence. We have to do not detected and treatment records. And also, iMapInvasives, we do intend to serve as that data repository. So data sets from a bunch of different sources are compiled into iMapInvasives. It's not just data collected through IMAP. We try to pull in other data sets that are important so that there's kind of a one-stop shop for invasive species data within at least our state in one spot. And just some, more info on how we've kind of connected IMAP and iNaturalist over the years. The New York National Heritage Program Invasives team has maintained an iNaturalist account since 2015. So we've been monitoring iNaturalist data for a while and keeping a lookout at what's being reported, potential sightings of new species in new areas. And other IMAP network states have also been doing similar things for about the same amount of time. And also, more recently, in the past couple of years, iMap has been collectively working to improve integration and data sharing with iNaturalist, so getting data in from iNaturalist into IMAP, and that is happening at one level right now, and Doug will talk about that later. But we're also continually, looking at that workflow and thinking about how that could be improved and expanded on in the future. And lastly, iNaturalist has also, started to recognize the concept of introduced and native species, and so they do have these like flags that pop up for records of species outside their native range. So that's something you might see if you're looking in iNaturalist. And I think I'll hand it back over to Doug now.
Perfect. Thank you, Mitch. And so next we'll jump into data sharing. So like Mitch alluded to, information does come from iNaturalist into the iMapInvasives database. One of the questions we get oftentimes from people who are out in the fields, like using their CCAP and identifying an invasive species, posting it to their iNaturalist account, they ask, is this enough? Does this data make its way over? And the overarching answer is yes, but with an asterisk next to the word yes. So data does move its way over. Our data analysts have created a crosswalk script that allows a weekly scrape of the entire iNaturalist database to look for invasive species records that reach a certain criteria. So for records to be caught in that crosswalk, they need to have two major things. They need to be research grade, so having 2/3 of all the people who suggest a identification for the species to agree on it. So if somebody reports black swallowwort and somebody else agrees with it, that's 2 out of 2, 100%, and that will make it research grade. The observer also has to have data sharing enabled on their records. So if you look at an individual iNaturalist record and you look in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see information on copyright. So this is an example of somebody who has their data essentially set to public. It'll say some rights reserved, whereas if somebody has their data as private, it will be all rights reserved. So if you post records to iNaturalist, or you have volunteers or know of people who are posting an iNaturalist and they want their records to go over to IMAP, then you need to make sure that this their copyright information is set to public, basically. And I also want to mention that this is not a perfect system. Like Mitch alluded to, there's always certain nuances or differences between the two databases that can sometimes trip up crosswalking. Obviously, iNaturalist is a huge database that looks at all species, so there's always going to be little discrepancies in like scientific names, subspecies versus different individual species, difference in common names, things like that. So that can cause issues that stop certain species from being caught up in the crosswalk. But we're always actively working to make sure that these are caught and still work and function the way we intend them to. So the data comes over from iNaturalist into iMapInvasives, and at that point, how do you use it? How do you look at it? So the way to enable iNaturalist data is to log into your iMapInvasives account. After you log in, it brings you to the map viewer screen. We always suggest setting a filter parameter first, just to make sure that everything loads a little bit faster. So if you have a certain area of interest or species of interest, setting that in the filter, and then from there, you can enable the iNaturalist data layer. So for an example, if I wanted to see all of the black swallowwort and pale swallowwort records on Long Island, New York, I can set black swallowwort in my filter, and then over on the right side in the different layer options where you would do things like toggle on confirmed records, not detected records, down in one of the sub drop-down menus, there's geographic map layers, and then iNaturalist data will be there. And you can toggle that on, and you'll be able to see those iNaturalist records. So the orange dots with the hexagon around them, those are the iMapInvasives records. And then the little pink diamonds, those are individual iNaturalist records. And again, I want to harp on setting the filter parameters first. iNaturalist gets millions of records every year. So even if we're crosswalking a small percentage of them, the unfiltered iNaturalist map ends up looking a little something like this. So this is all records for all invasive species. Doesn't really show you much, can't really tell what you're looking at. It also takes a very long time to load. So to save your computer the stress, setting the filter first is always good practice. So if we're taking a closer look at some of that data, if you want to zoom into a specific area of interest to the point where you can see individual IMAP records or take a better look at individual iNaturalist records, you could use something like the Identify Measure tool on the top toolbar to make a box around the records that you're interested in, which will bring up a small table where you can then filter between the different record types. It will have individual tabs for the IMAP invasive records and the iNaturalist records. From there, you can go to the details for each individual iNaturalist record, see more information about it, which species it is, as well as get a link to the original record on the iNaturalist database. I also want to point out here, this is a good example of some of those, differences in common names, scientific names that we mentioned before, where for swallowwort, sometimes it's Vince toxicum, sometimes it's Sinacum, and this is a pale swallowwort, but it's commonly called European swallowwort on the iNaturalist database. So small little nuances like this can sometimes cause issues, but we're always working to remedy those to make sure that crosswalking works smoothly. One other function that you can do with the iNaturalist data in the IMAP database is use it in reporting. So if you've ever used the automated export/report tool to make quick reports based on the IMAP data, you can also include iNaturalist data in that as well. So for example, if you wanted to do, again, all of the black swallowwort and pale swallowwort records on Long Island, you could set the area for it, the species, the presence records, and then you can also select the little toggle for including iNaturalist data. And if you toggle that on and then run the report, it will give you two separate windows where you will have your iNaturalist records and your IMAP invasive records in two separate tables to get the two separate amounts. Obviously, this is not an all-encompassing look at all of the records, again, because there are the ones that will not be research grade or the ones that are not set to data sharing, but it does give you an idea or fills in some of those gaps where there may be iNat records, but not IMAP records. From there, we'll jump into Vision API. So I've mentioned the Seek app a lot. This is very popular. I know plenty of people of all ages who are very interested in it. They love to be able to just, point their smartphone at a plant and have the app tell them what it is. And the way that it does this is through something called the Vision API, which is an image recognition technology that iNaturalist owns and has been training for a number of years. And so iMapInvasives recently has concluded a project where we've been trying to utilize this Vision API for our own uses. So we had a master's student by the name of Tapash Malik who did a project through Soon ESF in coordination with the New York Natural Heritage Program to see how we could use this machine learning technology to go through the backlog of IMAP invasive records to try to automate the process of confirming some of these, low-hanging fruit. So we focused on tier 4 species, so things like tree of heaven, garlic mustard, Phragmites, things that there were large numbers of records that hadn't been touched previously. And basically, we fed in the pictures from these records into the Vision API image recognition technology. And there's an example of the code that it outputs on the left side there. So this is an example of, we fed in this picture here of Tree of Heaven, and the API took a look at it and assigns scores based on how closely it believes the picture matches certain species. So for this picture, for Tree of Heaven, it received a score of 93. The next closest one would have been Black Walnut with a score of 3.6. So it's showing that it's very confident that it's a Tree of Heaven in that photo. So what we did is we fed in a bunch of those iMapInvasives photos for certain species and manually reviewed all of the outputs from that to see which scores they got in order to create score thresholds. So we were able to say, for photos of Tree of Heaven, if it scores an 85 or above, we know that it's almost always going to be correct in its identification of Tree of Heaven. So from there, we can then automatically confirm all of those records. So the project has concluded. We have run this several times on small batches, and we are currently working on making some final tweaks to the code where we can automate this and kind of scrape those backlogs of records that have not been touched previously. And again, for right now, we're focusing on just tier 4 species, relatively low impact or low priority, but with the possibility of expanding it more into the future. And if anybody's interested or wondering if we're ever going to be implementing this into our mobile app, the answer is probably not. The Seek app does that pretty well. Our mobile app is going to remain, you have to know what you're looking at in order to report it, unfortunately. Moving on to priority records scanning. So, as people are out there in the field using Seek or submitting pictures to iNaturalist directly, it's inevitable that they will come across species that we consider to be high priority, being reported in a county for the first time, or something that hasn't been found in New York State before. And we want to be able to know about these as soon as possible. So there are a few ways that we go about doing that. The first of which is through email alerts. This is something that we use on the IMAP team, but also you as an IMAP user can also set up email alerts for iNaturalist records as well. So it goes exactly the same as you were to set up a regular email alert. Log into your account, go to your email alerts tab in your menu and set up alerts. And there is a extra criteria for certain types of alerts where you can set up to have iNaturalist records trigger as well. So if you're setting up a weekly alert, you can have that enabled. It only works for weekly because, again, we bring those records over on a weekly basis. So if you have a immediate or a daily email alert, it won't be able to do iNat records. But you can have that on there. So this is an example of an alert I have on my account for the first time species are reported in a county. That also includes iNaturalist records. And again, if the alert you're trying to set up does not support iNaturalist records, it will give you this little disclaimer window here to explain why. It also mentions that it may include species that are native to your jurisdiction. This is really only the case for horizon scanning emails. So for instance, this is one I have set up for Albany County, and then it has buffers around that to show which species are reported within those buffers but are not yet present in Albany County. And this is just an example of one of the emails that I received in the past. So this shows me that there were 2 iNaturalist records for invasive species, Japanese spindle tree in Westchester, which is great to know. And then there was also a shrimp reported on Suffolk County, which I'm sure there was. So it goes to show, if you cast a more broad net, sometimes you will get things that you're not necessarily specifically interested in, but you will find things that could be of particular interest. The other way we scan for priority records is by actively scanning through what is coming into the iNaturalist database. So like Mitch had mentioned, we've maintained an iNaturalist account for a number of years, and we have set up several projects the same way that you can set up iMapInvasive projects, basically to keep an eye on certain areas or certain groups of species to see as new records come in. So this is an example of some of these iNaturalist projects that we have going right now for certain tier 1 or tier 2 species or tier 3 species in certain prism regions. And this basically just allows us to see certain records as they are submitted to the database. We don't have to wait for them to become research grade or be reviewed by other people. They'll pop up right away for us. And we can even be the ones to suggest species identification for those records to help them get to research grade, to get them into the iNaturalist database. And this has been helpful in the past. There have been several occasions where we have caught things before they've made it to us. One of the more recent examples is there was a hydrilla record on Long Island. Somebody had reported it to iNaturalist in a water body that we had not previously known it was in, and they also reported it directly to IMAP. So we were able to first see it on iNaturalist before they then put it in IMAP. And then a few days later, we also got a report directly from someone in the public that they said they saw it in iNaturalist and knew it wasn't in IMAP and wanted to make us aware of that. So while we are actively scanning the database, we also have other members of, community scientists who are also on the lookout for these kind of things as well. So it shows the benefit of having that crossover and coordination between users of the two databases. And the final thing we want to talk about is how we combine IMAP and iNat data, and I'll hand that back to Mitch to talk about that.
Thanks. And just to expand on what Doug was saying too, that targeted looking at records of certain species, that can be really helpful for like a limited number of high priority species. But that individual looking at species and setting up those projects, that could be very overwhelming to try to do for like all species at the statewide scale. So kind of the goal is like we have the that automated process of bringing iNaturalist data, which kind of captures like the wide net, gets most of the data in, and then we also do that sort of individual looking at certain species in iNaturalist to try to capture some of the high priority stuff that might be missed. And another way that we often interact with and use iNaturalist data is, so we have this statewide iMapInvasives data of invasive species, and we do analyses of that data. And sometimes it's valuable to bring in the iNaturalist data as well, because sometimes that fills data gaps that might be in the iMapInvasives distributions. So for one example, Doug mentioned the tiers a few times. So in New York State, we have this framework that we developed with the PRISMs, the Partnerships for Regional Invasive Species Management, as well as some statewide partners like the DEC and parks. So it's essentially categorizing impactful invasive species based on where they land on the invasive species curve. So that's on the slide right here. Essentially, the idea is that a species starts out, it's not here yet. The ability to manage it is it's pretty feasible because it hasn't expanded and become widespread yet. So when it's not here yet, prevention is the appropriate strategy. Then it gets here, but it's still low abundance. Eradication is still feasible. Then it expands in abundance to the point where you can no longer eradicate it, but it's not so widespread yet, so maybe it can still be contained. And then, as time goes on, species end up in the tier 4 category where they're invasive, they're impactful, but they are here to stay. We're not going to be able to get rid of them. Management is kind of targeted to specific areas and specific projects where we expect that management to make a difference in that local level, but we're not going to be able to really, get rid of the species at a regional scale. And Uh, so a first part of that analysis, so it's really a framework of categorizing species based on their abundance and other factors into these management categories. And the first part of that is using data, so calculating numbers of populations in certain regions, and then using that to kind of rank species between the low abundance ones, the high abundance ones, and then the prisms and other partners go through those lists and um, they reference those population counts, but they also bring in their own regional expertise and field experience to kind of put species in the right category. But the data piece at the beginning is an important part. And so we use the iMapInvasives data, and then we bring in the iNaturalist data into that as well. So when we calculate these statewide population counts and prism-wide population counts, they include iMapInvasives and iNaturalist data. And then the prisms and statewide partners review them, and then that's what is seen online, the tiers table, which I also linked to in the chat a couple chats ago. So that's just one example of how we use the iNaturalist data in conjunction with iMap data. And there are a couple things that we sometimes run into. The iNaturalist data is great, but there are, that exists for a certain purpose, and we're kind of scraping it and using it for our own purposes. So there's sometimes some issues that occur. So for example, species identity on iNaturalist records is like very often really great. There's lots of really great naturalists on the website that go through records. They also have that image recognition algorithm, which is pretty good. It's not right 100% of the time, but it's often very good. So yeah, species identity is usually great, but sometimes it's wrong. So sometimes, all it takes is if two people review it and say it's a certain species, and it could be any two people, and nobody else has said anything on that record yet, nobody's looked at it, then that will be considered research grade. So sometimes we do, see observations that might have the wrong species. So that happens sometimes. Another thing is that it can take time for species or take time for records to get to that research grade status. So it takes, people have to, at least I think one person will have to review the record, sometimes multiple. So yeah, it could be a really high priority record that gets into iNaturalist, but unless it gets that those eyes on it and it gets to research grade status, it might not be seen by the right people, like people who use IMAP, for example. It might not be seen for a couple weeks or a couple months. Another really common thing is that there are lots of reports of non-wild populations. So for example, in IMAP, typically we're having people report, like populations of knotweed in a natural area, that kind of stuff. Or doesn't even necessarily have to be a natural area, but kind of like a wild occurring, population. In iNaturalist, there's often reports of, plants that people have planted in their garden. And for using invasive species data, a lot of our invasive species are introduced because they're in that ornamental setting. People plant them in their gardens, but a Japanese barberry in someone's front yard, that's not necessarily the same as like the populations that we're trying to count in iMapInvasives. So that sometimes causes an issue, especially not so much for the widely established species like Japanese barberry, but sometimes for the more like newly emerging invasive species where we know that they're in lots of gardens and now they're just starting to show up in natural areas. It can be kind of hard to use iNaturalist data because they'll just kind of be like tons of points everywhere, but we know that that species is really only establishing in a couple places, and we would have to go through each record to try to figure out which one is in a garden and which one is escaped. Also, sometimes there's substantial location uncertainty. So like people can enter that, it's there's a 50-mile buffer around where this observation was really taken. So it's kind of hard to use something like that for a data analysis. And also, just to repeat what Doug was saying earlier, so the copyright licensing can be an issue. So yeah, if people have their settings in their account set to like no rights reserved or one of the really high rights reserved options, that data, it kind of can't be used by science or anything. It can like just exist in the iNaturalist platform and people can see it in there, but it's not going to go to any data repositories. It can't be used in data analysis unless I think in theory you could reach out to individual submitters of individual observations to try to get permission, but that's often not really feasible in sort of a larger project. And so some ways that we try to deal with that. So Doug started highlighting some parts on the screenshots on the right. So with species identity, um, we go through for some species, so typically species that are high priority to us or species that records that we've just noticed for whatever reason. And we can agree with the species ID that's proposed, or we can suggest an identification if it's wrong. So that that helps with the issue of species identity not always being correct, and that also helps get things to research grade faster, so they show up in the IMAP interface. And also, Doug also highlighted at the bottom the second one. So if you're in an iNaturalist record and you scroll past the species identification portion, there's actually more things that go into research grade qualification. It's not just the species ID. So for instance, for a record of maybe like Scotch broom in a garden or something, yeah, organized organism is wild field. That's kind of just like the default when anyone's submitting a record in, but many people submit data in their gardens and don't even notice that field, so they still go in as wild. But as if you're logged into iNaturalist, you can check the no side to suggest it as like, no, this is not a wild organism, and that will demote it from its research grade status. It'll still be in the database. It's as a casual record, I believe they call it, because it's sometimes still important to have those sorts of things documented. And then also location is accurate. You can also uncheck that. So sometimes we see like, maybe it's an aquatic plant, but it's showing up at the top of a mountain and looks like the person has reported that there's a 50-mile uncertainty. So for something like that, we would flag it as location is not accurate. And so these are things that anyone logged into iNaturalist can do. So those are some of the things that we on the invasives team at the New York Natural Heritage Program do as we use iNaturalist data. But others can do that too, especially if you're using iNaturalist for scanning for invasive species. And just to kind of summarize a lot of that in some key takeaways. So we find iNaturalist very useful. So it's this great source of these existing crowdsourced species observations. We didn't have to train people. Nobody had to mobilize this group of people to go and collect data on a particular invasive species. It's just there are just already people out there documenting organisms that they encounter outside. So it's this huge, just existing data set of species observations. So that's like just inherently useful. And yes, there are some caveats, like I've talked about and Doug has talked about in previous slides. And also that image recognition technology can be really, really powerful as well. So yeah, we totally recognize that iNaturalist is great and we use it a lot. So the place where we feel that IMAP, like the niche for iMapInvasives, we feel is that this is the place for people who are specifically surveying invasive species. So, for example, the data can be viewed and verified by relevant professionals like the prisms more efficiently in IMAP. It's kind of set up for that. There are options for the more complex survey types like not detected and polygon data and treatments. And also, IMAP is serving as a data repository, so we can bring in data sets from various groups, various agencies. We can bring in iNaturalist data, whereas iNaturalist is always going to be just iNaturalist data, which is often one of the biggest sources of data, but they're not going to be intaking bulk data sets in general. And so just one suggestion we have, and it comes from how we use iNaturalist, but if you use iNaturalist or you have volunteers that use iNaturalist or you're working with iNaturalist data, some things we would recommend is marking whether a species is wild or planted. So if you're reporting ornamentally planted plants, for example, make sure to flag that as not wild. And also, please check your copyright data sharing settings, or if you have volunteers that are using iNaturalist, please point this out to them, because that's a very, very important thing for the data to be used in other platforms or in analysis. And I did see a comment from Brittany earlier. So yeah, we could look into, I would have to remind myself exactly where people can adjust that setting. But yeah, we could include that in a follow-up. And I think that was everything we wanted to go through. So at this time, yeah, I see there's some questions in the chat already, and feel free to enter more. Yeah, thank you all so much for joining.